My name is Catherine Winters. I am 34 years old. I found out what my family truly thought of me while lying in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung 6 weeks after giving birth to my daughter Sophie. A delivery truck ran a red light on the interstate outside Portland. Everything changed in the space of a collision. I woke up groggy and in pain, with my right arm in a cast and my left hand trembling slightly as it lay across the blanket. The fluorescent lights hummed above me. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm. My husband Marcus was in Vancouver on a work trip, 4 hours away at best, probably closer to 6 by the time he could wrap things up and drive back home. The first words I heard from him came through a speakerphone someone had positioned near my pillow. "Catherine, the babysitter can only stay until 11. I called your mom. She's not coming." I knew before he said it. In that split second of silence, I heard something unmistakable in the background, the electronic pings and mechanical chimes of a casino floor. My mother was at the Sunriver Resort in Bend with her book club friends. She'd told my husband she couldn't possibly drive over because she needed to stay home and watch her cat while my sister, Victoria, was on a cruise ship somewhere in the Caribbean. A cruise ship, a vacation, and a cat. My 6-week-old daughter needed someone to stay overnight, and the answer was a cat. I didn't cry. I need you to understand that part, because people expect the woman in the hospital bed to fall apart, and I didn't. I felt something settle in my chest, a coldness that had nothing to do with the medications running through my IV line. I looked at the plastic identification band cinched around my wrist. Catherine Winters, DOB 3/17/1990, room 412. Then I reached over with my left hand and pulled my phone from the bedside table. I had a problem to solve, and solving problems was what I did best. It was always what I did best. That was always the problem. Before I tell you what happened, if you are new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell now, because what I discovered in the next 72 hours will fundamentally change how you think about family and money. Let me take you back to 18 months earlier, to a Sunday morning in Northeast Portland where my story actually begins. You need to understand who I was before that night, because it explains everything that came after. I grew up in a rental house in Northeast Portland where the furnace broke down at least twice every winter. My father had a weak heart even then. I remember the sound of him catching his breath on the stairs. My mother had a way of not being there when things broke. Victoria, my older sister by 4 years, had figured out early that if you complained enough, someone else would fix it. So I learned to fix things instead. By the time I was 12, I knew how to reset the circuit breaker, patch drywall, and file paperwork. By 16, I was helping my parents navigate hospital bills. I paid for community college by working the closing shift at a grocery store, scanning groceries and stocking shelves from 8 p.m. until midnight, 4 nights a week. I transferred on a scholarship to Oregon State University. I fought my way into a finance degree that nobody in my family really understood. My father asked me once what financial analysis actually meant, and when I tried to explain it, he'd nodded and said, "Well, as long as you're happy, kiddo." He never asked again. By 30, I was a senior financial analyst at a major tech company in Portland, one of those glass buildings downtown where the air conditioning never quite reaches the right temperature. I was the person they called into the room when the numbers absolutely had to be correct, when a merger hung in the balance, when a quarter's projections didn't make sense, when someone had made a mistake and there were millions of dollars riding on finding it. I'd spent a decade learning to read spreadsheets the way other people read faces. Numbers don't have favorites. They don't manipulate you. They don't smile while lying. Marcus and I had married at 26. We lived quietly beneath our means, 2 paychecks, 1 reliable car, no consumer debt. We decided to wait on children for a while, partly because we wanted to take our time, and partly because there was always something the family needed first. It never occurred to me then that always was the operative word, that there would never be a moment when the need stopped. My grandmother Eleanor understood. She was my mother's mother, a tall, sharp-eyed woman who smelled like coffee and carried herself with a kind of economic grace. She'd raised my mother entirely alone after my grandfather died at 43. She'd done it on a secretary's salary, somehow managing to keep a roof over their heads and books on the shelf. She'd never spoken about money the way other people did, with resentment or desperation. She spoke about it the way an engineer speaks about weight distribution. Practical, respectful, honest. The year before she died, she took my hand at Thanksgiving dinner while my mother was in the kitchen and my father was watching football. The table was scattered with the wreckage of the meal. Eleanor pulled a small manila envelope from her purse and placed it into my palm. "Open this when you're ready," she'd said, "not before." Inside was a handwritten letter and something else, a small piece of paper folded carefully. I'd looked at her, confused. "Later," she'd said, squeezing my hand. "Just keep that somewhere safe. And Catherine, listen to me carefully. Someone in this family has to watch the money, and it won't be your mother. It's going to be you. But that responsibility is not the same as love. Don't confuse the two." I'd been 23. I'd nodded like I understood, but I didn't, not really. I thought she was warning me about something external, about not letting people take advantage of me. I didn't realize she was warning me about myself, about the particular way I'd learned to equate being needed with being safe. I kept that envelope in a drawer for 11 years. I never opened it. For 9 years before this hospital night, I had been sending my parents $4,500 every single month. I never said the number out loud, not to Marcus, not to Victoria, not to anyone, not once. I told myself it was for my father's cardiac condition and the mortgage on their house. I told myself I was the only one steady enough to carry that weight. And somewhere along the way, being the steady one had become my entire identity. It had become the thing I actually believed made me worth keeping around. I wasn't naive. I was responsible to the point of self-erasure. There's a crucial difference between the two. My father David had his first heart episode when I was 13. I remember the sound of him collapsing in the bathroom, the panicked way my mother called 911. I remember sitting in the waiting room wearing clothes that smelled like smoke because my mother had been smoking in the car. 3 stents, a prescription for 6 medications, and a conversation with my mother in the hospital cafeteria where she'd told me, while stirring sugar into her coffee with a plastic stick, that we might lose the house. She said it casually, the way you'd mention you might need to repaint the kitchen. I was 13. I got my first job at 14. By the time I was 25, my father's bills had spiraled. Insurance gaps, experimental treatments, a medication that cost $400 a month, even with coverage. When my father called me sobbing one evening, actually sobbing, his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard, about bills he couldn't cover, I didn't hesitate. I set up the first recurring transfer that same night, $2,500 for medical expenses. It felt like the obvious thing to do. It felt like love. My mother seemed relieved when I told her. She didn't say thank you. She just said, "Well, that takes care of that, doesn't it?" It didn't, though. It never did. My sister Victoria called 6 months after that first transfer and mentioned, very casually, that she was thinking about going back to school for her real estate license. Real estate licensing in Oregon cost about $5,000 when you accounted for the course, the exam, the insurance, the advertising. She'd asked if I could help her with the initial investment. "Just help you get started," she'd said, "just until I'm earning again." I'd transferred $500 a month for a year. Then she'd gotten licensed. But she'd struggled to find clients in the competitive Portland market. Another $200 a month just temporarily. Then it became $300, then $400, then $500 again when she decided she needed better business cards and a professional website designer. My mother had asked me to help cover a tax bill she'd miscalculated, $1,600. Then she'd asked if I could help with property taxes since my father's income had diminished, $1,900 that quarter. By the time I was 30, the transfers had become automatic. I didn't think about them. They showed up in my banking notifications like clockwork, and I deleted the notifications without reading them fully. That was a choice I'd made without acknowledging I was making it. That was the moment where I'd crossed from being helpful into being complicit in my own erasure. I had set up 4 standing recurring transfers by the time Sophie was born. The first was labeled Parents, General, $2,000 monthly. This covered my mother's property taxes, her car insurance, and discretionary spending. My mother had a job as a part-time bookkeeper at a dental office, but she'd always struggled with her personal finances. The second transfer read House payment, $1,600 monthly. This went directly to the mortgage lender because my parents had fallen behind. My father's pension from his factory job had been smaller than they'd anticipated. The third said Dad medical, $900 monthly. This covered his medications, his cardiologist appointments, and specialist care. The fourth simply read Vicky support, $500 monthly. This was the one I thought about the least, because thinking about it forced me to confront something I didn't want to acknowledge. My sister was 38 years old. She'd never held a job for longer than 14 months. She'd gone through a divorce that had cleaned out what minimal savings she had. And I was covering her expenses while she figured out her life. $4,500 on the first of every month for 108 consecutive months. I'd set up the first transfer at 25, the night my father called me sobbing. And I'd never allowed myself to add up the total because the total felt like a door that would close behind me permanently once I walked through it. Marcus knew about some of this. He knew I was helping my parents with their mortgage. He'd been raised by people who took care of each other, and he respected that. But I'd never told him the total. I'd never said the number out loud. I'd learned very young that talking about money was considered shameful in my family. We didn't discuss it. We just let it happen. By the time I was lying in that hospital bed, my parents didn't have a job between them beyond my father's small pension. Victoria had never established a stable career, and I was the only reason their lives could continue as they were. I was also the only reason I couldn't say no. Now, that night in the hospital. That moment where I woke up to discover my mother wouldn't leave a casino floor to help with her 6-week-old granddaughter, something shifted. A wire that had been carrying too much current finally snapped. That night, the first thing I did wasn't revenge. The first thing I did was solve the actual immediate problem, because that's what I've always done. With my left thumb, I pulled up the number for an overnight childcare agency that Marcus and I had researched and vetted months before Sophie was born. We'd talked about needing backup childcare. We'd vetted 3 agencies. This was the most expensive one, but it had the best reviews. A woman answered on the second ring. I need a licensed overnight nurse for a 6-week-old starting immediately, I said, keeping my voice level and factual. I've been in a car accident. I'm currently hospitalized. She asked if the baby was medically stable. She's perfect, I said. I'm the one who's damaged. There was a beat of silence. I can have someone to you in 40 minutes, she said. 40 minutes later, a nurse named Claire let herself into my house using the security code Marcus provided over the phone. She washed her hands thoroughly, placed her bag on the kitchen counter, and pulled up a video feed on the baby monitor that connected to my hospital phone. She sent me a photograph of Sophie sleeping soundly, her tiny fist curled against her cheek, tucked beneath a lightweight blanket. I stared at that image for what felt like a very long time. The monitor showed the time in the corner, 11:47 p.m. Claire was preparing a formula bottle. Sophie was safe. Sophie was warm. Sophie was being watched by a licensed professional who knew exactly what she was doing. The ER nurse beside me, her name was Patricia, watched me set the phone down and asked gently if I had family coming to sit with me. It's handled, I said. What's next? Patricia blinked. People always blink when you refuse to perform the emotional breakdown they're braced for. I wasn't being cold. I was triaging the way you learn to do when you've spent your entire adult life being the only functional adult in a room full of people who should know better. My daughter was safe. She was warm. She was being watched by a professional. My husband was driving home as fast as the law allowed. He'd texted that he was making the drive in one push and would arrive around 6 a.m. My ribs would eventually knit back together. There was only one item left on my mental list that night, one I'd carried for 9 years and never once permitted myself to actually examine, and now my left hand was free, and my mind was very, very clear. I opened my banking app around 2 a.m. when the pain medication had made the worst of the physical agony distant and manageable. The login screen glowed in the dark, curtained bay like a small, cold moon. I navigated to the recurring transfers screen, the one I'd learned not to look at too carefully, the way you don't look directly at something that hurts your eyes. Inside, I could see all 4 standing transfers lined up like soldiers. The first was labeled Parents General $2,000 monthly. The second read, House Payment, $1,600 monthly. The third said, Dad Medical, $900 monthly. The fourth simply read, Vicky Support, $500 monthly. I knew them by absolute heart. I'd set them up manually. I'd watched them leave my account every month for 9 consecutive years. I'd learned not to think about where they went. The way you learn not to think about dying, it's just too heavy. $4,500 per month, 108 months. So I made myself do the math I'd been avoiding. The app calculated without hesitation or apology, because algorithms don't have mercy. $486,000, nearly $500,000, almost my entire decade of savings and earnings, evaporating one quiet automated payment at a time, while my mother told relatives at family dinners that I was doing beautifully on my own, that we were managing so well, that she was so proud of how Marcus and I had our lives together. Everything about that sentence was technically accurate, and everything about it was a lie. I pressed cancel on the first transfer. A green checkmark appeared on my screen, followed by a line of text I knew I'd remember for the rest of my life. Recurring transfer canceled. The first transfer, the one that had started everything, the one my father had sobbed for, stopped at that moment, just like that. 9 years of automatic compassion ended with one tap. I pressed cancel on the second transfer. The house payment stopped flowing. I pressed cancel on the third. My father's medical care stopped flowing. I pressed cancel on the fourth. My sister's support stopped flowing. 4 taps of my left thumb, maybe 20 seconds total. 9 years of my life simply stopped, the way you turn off a faucet, the way you decide to breathe instead of drown. I felt no triumph. I felt no grief, just a strange, flat clarity, the same feeling I get when a spreadsheet finally balances perfectly after hours of searching for a discrepancy that's been corrupting everything. Relief. Rightness. The mathematics of the universe clicking back into alignment. As I was closing the banking app, my eyes caught on something buried deep in the transaction history. A single line item from 2 years back, labeled under Dad Medical. It read, Loan to V, $40,000. The V wasn't for my father's surgery. It was my sister's initial. I stared at that line for a long time. $40,000. I'd never known that transfer existed, which meant my father had taken out a loan against his own house to give to my sister, and I'd been unknowingly subsidizing that loan through my Dad Medical transfers for 24 months. I locked my phone and lay in the dark, listening to the heart monitor count my pulse, 72 beats per minute, steady and mechanical and honest. The nurses changed shift at 3 a.m. The hospital settled into the deep quiet that belongs only to medical facilities in the middle of the night, when pain and crisis feel like permanent conditions and healing seems impossible. And I finally let myself ask the question I'd spent 9 years avoiding. Why had I done it? The easy answer, the one strangers offer when you tell them this story, is that I was weak and desperate for love. That answer is wrong. If you've ever been the dependable one in a family that runs on dependability, you already know the truth. I did it because somewhere along the way, I decided that being needed was the same as being safe. If I was the load-bearing wall that held everyone up, nobody could ever remove me. Nobody could ever abandon me. I couldn't be replaced. I couldn't be left behind. I couldn't be discarded the way my mother had learned to discard people who didn't serve her immediate needs. My grandmother understood that about me before I even understood it myself. Her name was Eleanor. She was a tall, sharp-eyed woman who smelled like coffee and carried herself with the kind of economic grace that comes from making every dollar count. The year before she died, she took my hand at Thanksgiving dinner while my mother was in the kitchen and my father was watching football. Someone has to watch this family's money, Eleanor had said, and it won't be your mother. It's going to be you. But Catherine, listen to me carefully. That responsibility is not the same as love. Don't confuse the two. She'd pressed something into my hand, a manila envelope. "Open this when you're ready," she'd said. Not before. I'd kept it in a dresser drawer for 11 years without opening it. 3 hours after I canceled those transfers, at roughly 5 in the morning when the sky outside my hospital window was just beginning to lighten, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number wasn't one I recognized, but it had a local 503 area code, a Portland number. I almost didn't answer. The hospital staff had told me to rest, and I was exhausted in a way that went deeper than the medications running through my IV line. Exhausted in a way that suggested my body had been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to exist without that weight. But something made me pick up. Some small voice that felt like Eleanor. "Is this Catherine Winters?" The voice belonged to an older man, measured and professional. "It is. My name is Gerald Richardson. I'm an estate attorney. I believe your grandmother, Eleanor Hartwick, left instructions with my firm regarding a conversation I was to facilitate with you at a particular moment in your life. I think that moment may have arrived." I sat up in my hospital bed, pain shooting through my chest, and didn't register it. "What are you talking about?" "I'd rather show you in person," he said. "When you're able to have a visitor, I'd like to come by the hospital. I'm bringing something Eleanor left with my firm. She said you would know it when you saw it." I gave him my room number and hung up. Then I opened my phone to the banking app one more time. All 4 transfers still showed canceled. The logic was simple and absolute. I had made a choice. I had made it consciously. I had made it while facing facts I'd been running from for a decade. And in exactly 3 hours, I was about to discover that my grandmother had prepared for this moment long before I'd even understood it was coming. Because Eleanor had always known who I was. And she had always known what this family would do to someone who knew how to take care of them. She had always known what I would finally do when I stopped being afraid. Gerald Richardson arrived at my hospital room at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock on the wall above the door, the kind with a loud second hand that clicked off moments like someone marking a countdown. He was older, maybe mid-70s, with silver hair and the kind of careful posture that suggests a lifetime of handling other people's important papers. He carried a manila folder and something smaller, something wrapped in what looked like a kitchen towel. "Miss Winters," he said, extending his hand. "I'm glad to see you're awake. Eleanor said if I ever contacted you, you'd probably be in a moment of transition. I didn't expect it to be quite this literal." I shook his hand. My ribs sent a shooting pain across my chest, and I kept my face absolutely neutral. "What did she leave with you?" He pulled up a chair, the uncomfortable plastic kind that hospitals provide for visitors who might stay a while, and sat down. For a moment, he just looked at me. It was a measuring look, the kind you give someone before deciding whether they're ready for something. "Eleanor came to my office in 1998, he said carefully. "She was 73 years old. She told me she expected to live another 15 years, maybe 20. She said she wanted to leave instructions for a conversation that would need to happen at a very specific point in her granddaughter Catherine's life. She said I would know when that moment arrived because Catherine would make a particular choice. And she said that when Catherine made that choice, I was to bring her 2 things." He opened the manila folder. Inside were several documents, legal papers I could see, notarized and dated, and something else. A letter, handwritten in the careful script of someone who'd learned penmanship in a world that still valued such things. "The first thing," Gerald said, "is this letter. Eleanor wrote it the day she came to see me. She told me it was a validation. She said Catherine would need to know that someone who loved her had understood exactly what this moment would feel like, and that she'd prepared for it deliberately." My throat tightened. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to stay calm and factual. But my hands were shaking slightly as I reached for the letter. The envelope had my name on it in Eleanor's handwriting. Catherine. "The second thing," Gerald continued, unwrapping the kitchen towel, "is this." He placed something on the hospital bed beside me. A small, leather-bound journal, maybe 3 inches by 5 inches, the kind of thing someone might carry in a pocket or keep on a nightstand. The leather was soft and worn, the color of old cognac. "This is Eleanor's personal financial journal," Gerald said. "Every money decision she made from 1955 to 1988. When she took you to see me, she said she wanted you to have this. She said she wanted you to know with absolute certainty that someone in your family understood exactly how much you were capable of and exactly how much you could afford to lose before losing yourself." I opened Eleanor's letter with my left hand. The cast on my right was making everything difficult, but I refused the help he offered. The letter began, "Dear Catherine, if you're reading this, you've finally said no." Eleanor's handwriting covered 3 pages. Single-spaced, no wasted space. Efficient, just like her. "I'm going to write what she said word for word because you deserve to hear it exactly as she wrote it, and because I've read it approximately 300 times since that morning and I can reproduce every word. Dear Catherine, if you're reading this, you finally said no. I want you to know that I saw you coming from the moment you were born. Your mother came to the hospital to show you off, and I held you in my arms and I knew. I knew you were the kind of child who would grow up watching other people's needs instead of your own. I knew because your mother was raised by me. And I spent so many years being that person that I didn't even realize I'd raised a daughter who had learned to be that way too. But Catherine, there is a difference between compassion and self-erasure, and I need you to understand that difference before it costs you everything. When your father collapsed that first time, I watched you decide something. You were 13 years old, and in one moment you decided that his survival was your responsibility. You were a child, and you decided to carry an adult's weight. That wasn't love. That was fear. And I want you to know that I recognized it because I made that same decision when I was your age. I spent 40 years being the person my family could always count on. I spent 40 years believing that if I made myself indispensable, no one could hurt me. And do you know what that belief cost me? It cost me my own life, not in any dramatic way, but in 1,000 small ways. It cost me the ability to say no. It cost me the ability to be selfish enough to have a marriage that lasted longer than 5 years. It cost me the ability to rest. When I die, and I will die soon, Catherine, I can feel it. I don't want my last memory of you to be sitting at a dinner table, listening to your mother describe all the things you've done for her, thus never once thinking to ask you what you needed. So I'm writing this to you now, at this moment when you finally said no. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to me, so that you know what happens to women like us if we don't stop. In 1960, when I was 35 years old, I made the same calculation you just made. I added up all the money I'd given away. It was $38,000 at that time, and you have to understand, that was different money then. That was enough to have bought a house outright. That was generational wealth. And I realized that no one had ever asked me if that's what I wanted to give away. They'd simply taken it because I was the kind of person who said yes. I sat down that night with a piece of paper, and I did something I'd never done before. I wrote out what my life might have looked like if I'd kept that money. What I could have built, where I could have traveled. What kind of person I might have become if I'd been allowed to become her, instead of becoming this, the person every single person in my family reached for first. And Catherine, the scariest part wasn't realizing what I'd lost. The scariest part was realizing that I'd done it to myself. No one forced me to give that money away. I chose to, because I believed it made me worth keeping. So now I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone, and I need you to listen very carefully, because this is the part that matters. After I added up that money, after I understood what I'd done, I told my family no. I told them the transfers would stop. I told them I couldn't be responsible for their lives anymore. And do you know what happened? The world didn't end. It just shifted. Their suffering continued, but it became their responsibility instead of mine. And I got to find out who I was when I wasn't too busy drowning to think about it. That was 1960, Catherine. 68 years have passed since then. I married again, a kind man, a man who didn't need me to save him. We had a quiet life with enough money that we could take vacations. I learned to say no without guilt. I learned to watch other people struggle with their own problems without rushing in to solve them. But I've spent every single day of those 68 years watching my daughter, your mother, repeat the pattern that I started, and I've watched you inherit it. And now I'm dying, and I'm watching you about to begin a life of self-erasure just like mine. So I'm giving you two things, Catherine. I'm giving you this journal so you can see exactly how I made my decisions, every single one. The good ones and the terrible ones, and the ones that were actually just fear wearing a mask that looked like responsibility. And I'm giving you this letter so you know that when you made this choice, the choice to say no, someone who loves you understood exactly what it meant and thought it was the most important decision you might ever make. Your mother will call you screaming. She will tell you that you're ungrateful. She will tell you that your father will die without that money. She probably won't call to check on you after your accident, but don't let that fool you. She'll find out eventually, and she'll be hurt that you didn't tell her personally, as if your suffering was somehow about her feelings. Your sister will cry. She will tell you that she can't survive on her own. She will tell you that you never gave her a fair chance. She will threaten to move away and never speak to you again. All of this will be real, and all of it will be someone else's problem to solve. But Catherine, here is what I need you to understand. Your father loves you. He loves you in the way that a drowning man loves a life preserver. And that's not a sustainable way to love someone. That's not real love. That's just dependency with a kind face. Real love says no sometimes. Real love says, I cannot fix this for you, and I love you anyway. Real love walks away from people who will take everything you have and then blame you for not having more to give. When you read this letter, you'll be in a moment of crisis. You'll be hurt, you'll be in pain, and you'll be thinking very clearly for the first time in probably a decade. You'll be thinking clearly because you've finally stopped trying to fix everything and everyone around you, and you've realized that the only thing you can actually fix is yourself. So I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then I'm going to let you go forward into whatever comes next. I was wrong, Catherine. Not about the importance of saying no, I was right about that. But I was wrong about something else. I spent 68 years believing that my family didn't really love me, that they just needed me. And when I finally stopped being useful, when I was old and sick and couldn't help anyone anymore, I discovered that I was right. But here's the part I got wrong. I spent so much time resenting them for only needing me that I never noticed when I stopped actually needing them. And that's the real freedom, Catherine. Not the money, not the time. The freedom is in becoming the kind of person who doesn't need this family to prove your worth. Your mother will want that money back eventually. Not because she suddenly loves you more, but because she'll need it more. Your sister will apologize and ask for another chance. Your father will cry, and that cry will break your heart, and you'll almost give in, and you'll remember this letter, and you won't. And that will be the hardest thing you ever do, because that will be the moment you realize your family would have let you drown to stay afloat. I hope you're stronger than I was, Catherine. I hope you can do the thing I waited until I was 73 to do. I hope you can become your own person without needing permission from anyone who's ever taken from you. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry no one else has ever told you that the most important thing you can do is learn to say no to people who claim to love you while treating you like a vending machine. You'll understand soon enough. With love and absolute certainty, Eleanor. I finished reading the letter at 9:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 2 days after a delivery truck rewrote my life. My hands were shaking. My face was wet, and I didn't remember deciding to cry. She was very precise about timing, Gerald said quietly. She told me that you would make this decision between the ages of 32 and 36. She said it would come after something that forced you to choose between your family and your survival. She said you'd choose correctly, and then you'd doubt yourself, and then you'd need to know that someone who understood exactly what you were or gave you permission to do it. I couldn't speak. I was holding Eleanor's journal in my lap, like it was made of spun glass. There's one more thing, Gerald said, and he pulled another envelope from the folder. This one was thicker. Eleanor set up a trust when she was 75. She transferred $247,000 into it with instructions that it be given to you at the moment you said no to your family. She called it Catherine's permission money. She said if you were strong enough to say no, you were strong enough to rebuild. And she said this money was to help you do that without having to depend on anyone ever again. The room tilted. I might have stopped breathing. Gerald noticed and pushed a call button, but I shook my head. "I'm fine," I said, and my voice sounded like someone else's. "I'm fine. I just need to understand what she did." "She gave you options," Gerald said simply. "When you said no to your family was going to suffer. Some of that suffering they should have carried all along. But Eleanor understood that you might not be strong enough to watch it, and she wanted you to have the choice to rebuild without guilt. She wanted you to know that you could say no and still be safe." I opened the envelope. Bank statements, proof of the trust, a quarterly report showing how the money had been invested, earning modest returns, compounding into something almost miraculous by sheer patience. "There's a letter in there, too," Gerald said. "Eleanor wrote it when she set up the trust. She said it contains very specific instructions for what you're allowed to do with this money, and what you're absolutely not allowed to do." I pulled out a second letter, shorter than the first, folded into thirds. The letter said, "Catherine, you are not allowed to give this money to your family. You are not allowed to use it to help them recover from the consequences of your boundary. You are allowed to use it to build a life that doesn't require their approval or their presence. That's the only rule. You've spent your entire adult life believing that your worth is tied to your usefulness. Let me be very clear. You are not useful. You're a person. You deserve to become one." Eleanor, I held that letter in my shaking hands while a nurse came in to check my blood pressure, and a monitor beeped steadily, and the hospital mourning happened around me like it was occurring in a separate dimension. "She believed in you very much," Gerald said, standing to leave. "She said if anyone could resist the guilt, it would be you. She said you were the kind of person who understands that compassion without boundaries is just self-destruction with a gentle face." After he left, I opened Eleanor's financial journal. The leather was soft. The entries were meticulous. Dates, amounts, reasons. I could see her entire life written in receipts and transfers and careful calculations. I could see the exact moment in 1960 when the frequency of her entries changed, when they became less about tracking what she was giving away and more about tracking what she was building for herself. And I understood for the first time in my life that Eleanor hadn't just known what I would do. She had known what I would need. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking right now. You're thinking that Eleanor made this decision easy for Catherine, that $247,000 in a letter don't really address the complexity of family obligation. You're thinking that permission from the dead is nice, but it doesn't actually change what happens when real living people start screaming. Trust me, I asked myself the same thing. But let me ask you something. If someone you trusted absolutely told you that you were allowed to choose yourself, would you believe them? Or would you keep choosing everyone else because the guilt was so much louder than the voice of reason? Drop reason or guilt in the comments. I want to know what's louder for you. My mother called at 11:04 a.m. I know the exact time because I was staring at the hospital clock again. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask how Sophie was. She asked where the mortgage payment was. The automated transfer didn't go through, she said, and her voice was bright with the kind of panic that sounds like irritation. I checked the account this morning and it wasn't there. Did you have a problem with the payment? I held Eleanor's journal in my lap. I could feel its weight. I canceled all the transfers, I said, as of 2 a.m. this morning. There was a silence. I could hear her breathing change. What do you mean you canceled them? I mean, I went into my banking app and canceled every recurring transfer. Your mortgage payment will no longer be automatically sent. Your property tax payment will no longer be automatically sent. Dad's medical payment will no longer be automatically sent. Victoria's support will no longer be automatically sent. Catherine, what the hell are you talking about? You can't just... Your father is going to lose his house. We have a payment due on the 21st. That's 2 weeks away. Yes, I said. You'll need to figure out how to make that payment. This is insane. You're in a hospital bed and you're making crazy decisions. Marcus needs to hear about this. We need to talk to someone about... Catherine, are you on pain medication? I'm very clear, I said. I'm clearer than I've been in a decade. And the answer is no. All of it is no. From this moment forward, the answer to every request for money is no. My mother made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a scream. You selfish bitch. Do you understand what you're doing? Your father will have a heart attack, your sister will have nowhere to live, and you're lying in a hospital bed where I should be sitting with you, and instead you're destroying this family. You chose not to come, I said. You were at a casino. That was the moment I understood that I was the only one carrying this family, and I was the only one it would ever matter to. So the answer is no. I'm calling Marcus. I'm calling your father. We're going to sort this out right now. I hung up. The monitor beside me beeped steadily. My heart rate was elevated. I noticed, but I didn't panic. I'd expected this. Victoria called at 11:17 a.m. Mom is hysterical, she said immediately. She's saying you canceled everything. Tell me you didn't actually do that. I did. Catherine, I have rent due in 3 weeks. I have a car payment. What was I supposed to do? What you should have done 7 years ago, I said. Figure it out. That's not fair. I'm trying my hardest. I've got interviews coming up for... You've had interviews coming up for 8 years, I said. Real estate licensing didn't work out. Photography didn't work out. Freelance consulting didn't work out. Yoga instructor certification didn't work out. And each time you failed, I covered the gap. Each time I made it possible for you to try again without actually suffering the consequences of trying and failing. So now you get to suffer those consequences. And maybe, with actual pressure, you'll figure out how to do something that actually works. My sister was crying. I could hear the wet sound of her breath, the immediate escalation into full-body sobs. I can't, she was saying. I can't do this on my own. I'm not like you. I can't just be strong and handle everything. I need help. You need to learn how to help yourself, I said. Everyone who loves you has been preventing you from learning that. But I don't anymore, so the answer is no. She hung up without responding. My father called at 11:42 a.m. His voice was small, shaken, not angry, worse than angry. Your mother says you canceled the house payment. Is that true? Yes, I said. Catherine, I don't understand. The house, we have a mortgage. We have an obligation. How am I supposed to? How will I explain this? That's your problem now, I said. For the first time in 9 years, it's actually your problem, not mine. I don't have the money to make the payment. Catherine, I'm 68 years old. I can't take another job. I can't. His voice broke. Actually broke, the way it had when he called me that night 9 years ago, when he'd sobbed about medical bills he couldn't cover. The same sound, the same powerlessness. Except this time I heard it differently. This time I heard a grown man who'd made choices that created his own crisis and then let his child solve it. You'll figure it out, I said. You could have figured it out 9 years ago. You chose not to because I made it easier not to. I'm not making it easier anymore. You're right, he said, and something in his voice changed, got harder. You're right, and you're also a monster. You're in a hospital because you got hit by a truck and your first instinct is to hurt the people who love you. That's not strength, Catherine. That's pathological. I didn't respond. I hope it was worth it, he said. I hope whatever you think you're getting out of this is worth destroying this family. He hung up. I set the phone down. My hands were not shaking. My heart rate on the monitor was normal. I was fine. I was absolutely, completely fine. I opened Eleanor's journal and I found the entry from 1960. The exact date when she'd added up all the money, done the math, and made the choice that my father had just called pathological. She'd written, "Today I chose myself. Tomorrow they'll tell me it was wrong. The day after tomorrow, I'll believe them. But I'm going to keep choosing anyway, because the alternative is disappearing entirely." My father never called back. But my mother called again at 2:15 p.m. and then at 3:47 p.m. The third time I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. "Catherine, it's Mom. Look, we can talk about this. We can work something out. Maybe we were too hard on you. Maybe we didn't appreciate how much you were doing. But you're killing us. You're literally killing your father. His blood pressure is through the roof. He's having chest pains. If something happens to him, that's on you. That's your responsibility." I listened to the message twice. Then I blocked her number. Marcus arrived at the hospital at 4:23 p.m. He looked like he'd been driving for 10 hours straight, which he had. His hair was messy, his shirt was wrinkled, and when he saw me lying in the hospital bed, he went completely still. "Jesus," he said quietly, "you look like hell." "I canceled all the transfers," I said. "Just so you know, before you hear it from my mother, which you will, because she's going to call you repeatedly, I canceled every single one this morning. $4,500 a month stopped flowing at approximately 2 a.m. Marcus sat down very slowly in the chair beside my bed. "Okay," he said. I waited for him to say more, to tell me I was wrong, to ask me how we'd weather the financial impact, to do something. "Just okay?" I asked. "Catherine," Marcus said, and he reached over and took my left hand, the one without the cast. "I've been waiting for you to do that for 3 years, since Sophie was born and your mother wouldn't come to the hospital. I wanted to say something that night, but I didn't know how. I didn't want to push you towards something you weren't ready for. So yeah, just okay. More than okay." "Your daughter is with a stranger," I said. "Your daughter is with a licensed professional who will keep her safe until I take over tomorrow morning," Marcus said. "And she's safe because you made a choice that scared you more than anything else could have, and you did it anyway. That's being a mother. That's being a woman who understands that the only person she can fix is herself." He brought his hand to his face, and he cried quietly while I held Eleanor's journal and understood finally what Eleanor had meant. The freedom wasn't in the money. The freedom was in knowing that someone who understood what you were doing had loved you anyway. The news spread through Cedar Bluff the way things spread in small towns, not through any formal announcement, but through the invisible network that connects grocery store workers and dental hygienists and yoga instructors at community classes. By Thursday morning, when my mother was released from her hospital stay, because, yes, there was a hospital stay, her blood pressure had actually spiked to concerning levels. Approximately 47 people in our small town of 5,000 knew that David and Michelle Winter's daughter had cut them off financially. By Friday morning, that number had probably doubled. I found out because my father called me back at 9:17 a.m. on Thursday, and his voice was different, softer, afraid. "We got a notice," he said, "from the bank. We have 14 days to bring the mortgage current before they start foreclosure proceedings." I didn't say anything. "Your mother is looking for a job," he continued. "A real job, not the part-time bookkeeping thing. She's putting together applications. We're going to sell the car. We're going to figure this out. But Catherine, I need you to understand that a lot of people think you did something wrong. The Hendersons at church, they told me that." "I don't care what the Hendersons think," I said. "I know you don't. That's part of the problem. You've never cared what anyone thinks. That's why you're able to do this without any guilt." "I have plenty of guilt," I said. "I just have more of something else, and I'm not changing my answer." He was silent for a moment. "Your sister is moving back in with us temporarily. While she figures things out, she's working at a coffee shop now, starting on Monday." "Good," I said. "She cried for 6 hours straight when she realized you weren't going to help her." "I know," I said. "That was the point. She has to actually suffer the consequences of her choices for the first time in her adult life. That's the only way she'll actually change." My father made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. "You've become someone I don't recognize," he said. "No," I said. "I've finally become someone you can't use. Those are different things." He hung up. But he didn't stay quiet. Because by Saturday morning, my father had given an interview to the Cedar Bluff Gazette, not directly about his daughter, but about financial boundaries in families. He talked about his own mistakes. He talked about how he'd allowed his daughter to become his solution instead of becoming his own. He didn't name me, but everyone in Cedar Bluff knew who he was talking about. And that interview changed something. Because it wasn't the story everyone had been telling themselves. The story they'd been telling was that I was cold, ungrateful, selfish, a woman who'd abandoned her family in their hour of need. But my father's story was different. My father's story was about a man who'd asked his child to save him, and she had. And then one day she'd said no, and he'd realized he didn't know how to save himself. My mother saw that interview. According to Victoria, who called me to tell me this, my mother had gone very quiet and then gone into the bedroom and hadn't come out for 8 hours. The following Monday, Victoria called me from the coffee shop where she was working her first official shift. "I'm standing in the break room," she said, wearing an apron that says "Brew it up," and I have $18.47 in tips from my first 4 hours. And I'm not going to lie, I want to cry. I want to call you and ask you to fix this. I want to ask you to send me money so I don't have to wear this apron and smell like espresso. But you're not going to ask, I said. No, she said, I'm not. Because I'm 38 years old, and you're right, I've never actually had to succeed at anything. I've never had to fail at something and then keep trying anyway. Everyone just made it go away. I know, I said. I might hate you for this for a while, Victoria said. Probably, I said. That's okay. It's weird, though, she continued, because I already feel different. I feel like I'm actually real in a way I wasn't before, like my life is actually mine. She hung up, and I realized she was starting to understand what Eleanor had understood. That suffering, when it's actually yours to carry, is the price of becoming real. My mother called me on Thursday of that same week. Her voice was different, too. Smaller, but not defeated, just quieter. I got a job, she said. Full-time at a dental practice in Salem. 45 minutes away, but it pays $42,000 a year. I start in 2 weeks. That's good, I said. I wanted you to know that, she said. I wanted you to know that I'm doing something. I'm not just sitting here being angry at you anymore. I'm actually trying. Mom, I said carefully, I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took me cutting you off financially to make it happen. She was quiet for a long moment. You're not actually sorry, she said. No, I said. I'm not. I'm relieved, but I'm also sad that it had to happen this way. I'm sad that you couldn't do it for yourself, and I'm sad that it took a crisis to make you understand that you could. I've been thinking about something Eleanor wrote, my mother said, and I realized in that moment that Marcus must have told her about Eleanor's letters. She wrote that I was raised by her to be this way, to let other people solve my problems. And then I raised Victoria the same way. And then Victoria became someone who couldn't solve her own problems. But you, somewhere along the way, you decided to solve everyone's problems. So you're the break. You're the point where this cycle ends. Yes, I said. I don't like being on the other side of that break, she said. I know, I said. But you'll like yourself more now. Eventually. Give it time. She hung up, and she didn't call back that week. But the week after that, she sent me a text message with a single word. Thanks. I didn't respond, because responding would have opened a door I wasn't ready to open. The boundary needed to stay firm. But I kept that text message. I was released from the hospital on Friday of my first week. Marcus drove me home carefully, taking each turn like the roads were made of spun glass. Sophie was sleeping in her car seat, a tiny fist curled against her cheek, the exact same image I'd stared at for hours from my hospital bed. The house smelled like home. Like the life I'd built with someone who'd waited for me to become brave enough to protect it. I sat in my study, a small room off the kitchen with a desk and a bookshelf, and I took out Eleanor's journal. The leather was worn soft from her years of carrying it. The entries were small, precise, full of her careful accounting. And I turned to the very last entry, dated August 1988, 5 years before she died. I understand now that the money was never the point. The point was learning to say no to people who loved me, and knowing that I could survive that love turning cold and bitter. I survived it. I'm 78 years old, and I survived it, and on the other side of that survival, I became my own person. I closed the journal, and I held it against my chest. 4 calls, 12 minutes, 1 woman, 2 parents, 1 sister. I did not yell, I did not threaten. I said no 4 times, and each time the answer was the same. The answer is no. My father accepted it first, maybe because he'd already experienced his own moment of understanding. My sister accepted it second, because she was learning to accept the consequences of her choices. My mother accepted it third, when she realized that her daughter wouldn't break, no matter how hard she pushed. And Victoria? Victoria called me 6 months after I left the hospital when she'd been working at the coffee shop long enough to know she could find a different job if she tried. She'd been promoted to shift supervisor. She was making $32,000 a year plus benefits. "I bought myself dinner tonight," she said into the phone. "I made the money. I spent it on myself, and no one died. The world didn't end." "No," I said, "it didn't." "I think I'm going to look into getting certified as a barista trainer," she said. "I think I might actually be good at this. I think I might actually want to keep doing this." "Then do it," I said. She did. My father, meanwhile, had found work as a consultant for his old factory. Part-time, remote work that used his 50 years of industrial knowledge. He and my mother sat down with a financial advisor, someone I recommended but didn't pay for, and they made a plan. They sold the house at a slight profit because the market in Portland had shifted in their favor. They bought a small condo, paid for it almost entirely in cash, and suddenly found themselves in a position they'd never been in before. Solvent. My mother worked for 2 more years, then retired at 65 to a stable retirement account. My father's consultant work had turned into a proper income stream, and for the first time in 40 years, they didn't need anyone to save them. It took 8 months, but my father finally called and asked to take me to dinner. "Just you and me," he said. "Not the whole family, just us. Because I have some things I need to say to you, and I need to say them to you." We went to a restaurant in Portland, a quiet place with good food and tables far enough apart that we could speak without being overheard. My father ordered a salad. I ordered a steak. We made small talk about the weather, about Sophie, about his consulting work. And then he set his fork down. "I want you to know that I understand what you did," he said. "And I want you to know that you were right. I was drowning, and you were the life preserver, and instead of teaching myself to swim, I held on tighter. And then when you let go, it was terrifying. But Catherine, I learned to swim." He was crying. Just a little. Just enough that he had to pause and compose himself. "I learned to swim," he said again, and it turned out that the water wasn't even that deep. The whole time, I could have touched the bottom. I was just too scared to try. And you were too kind to force me to try. So thank you for stopping being kind. Thank you for being mean enough to save my life. I didn't cry. I just sat there and listened to my father tell me that he understood, and that he